Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Again, if you're coming to watch this video, welcome to our channel, The Veteran's View, where a veteran, myself, discusses some current events and some current issues in my community of Batchewana First Nation, as well as other First Nation communities across Canada. Bonjour, bedasagin and dejnakas, megazen nondem, bawating donjaba. Once again, that was a greeting in my Ojibwe language stating my Anishinaabe name, my clan, and where I'm from. So let's get right into it. Today I want to discuss fiscal responsibility, on why it's important and what it is. So let's start off by giving the definition of fiscal responsibility. Fiscal responsibility. For government institutions, fiscal responsibility describes the ability to balance between government and spending. In fact, it would define the obligation of the government to maximize incomes by using their spending powers while also ensuring that inflation does not spiral up. So, that's what fiscal responsibility is. I think it's extremely important because we look at our First Nation communities, and the number one problem across the lands, including Batchewana First Nation, is monies, jonyas. Where's the money? Where is this? So, no one can ever have an answer, to where all the money is. And that's extremely troubling, especially for communities that are under 1,000 people, 2,000, under 5,000 people. The budget should be black and white, clear, but it isn't. Myself right now, I live close to Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, Canada. I can go down to City Hall right now today and ask for a budget, ask for the audit, and I will probably get it in a few days. And it'll show me everything they spent in the city and everything else. But you come to any First Nation and ask those questions, a big, oh no, we can't get that now, we can't do that now. And a lot of it comes from, not too many people know what our finances are like. So I'm going to try to describe it in what I think it is and why I think it's a problem that can be fixed. And during this discussion, I'm going to bring our community a solution to fix this. So first of all, when we talk about monies, every good politician in our communities is going to come at you and say, well, we have the First Nations the First Nations Financial Transparency Act. So they're going to stand behind that 110% because the federal government enacted that. I'm just going to go and read what it is. The First Nations Financial Transparency Act requires that First Nations to whom the act applies make their audited, consolidated financial statements and the schedule of remuneration and expenses available to their members, as well as post and publish the documents on a website. That's the First Nation Financial Transparency Act. So they're going to make you think that they show us everything that they got. They're saying, oh, we're abiding by the rules. We're doing what the government tells us. This is the information you need. But let's clear this up. We have two different funding streams in our communities. I'm going to discuss Batchewana First Nation. So what we have is, on one side, which the First Nation Financial Transparency Act falls under, is Batchewana First Nation. Batchewana First Nation receives government funding for all kinds of stuff, and that's what the Financial Transparency Act gives. So I'm going to give an example. I got this box of cookies here. There's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 cookies in this jar. So this is the government giving to Batchewana First Nation this cookies. I'm just using this as an example for our monies to make it a little bit easier for us. But there's 12 cookies in here. They give this to Batchewana First Nation. Batchewana First Nation issues out their cookies, our monies, and does what they can with it and does a good job with it. In return, the First Nation Financial Transparency Act makes them obligated and responsible to tell us what they've done with the 12 cookies in this funding or money. So whatever government funding that comes to us under the Financial Transparency Act, they have to tell the members 100% what they're getting and where they're spending it. Here comes the big issue. We also have Batchewana First Nation Incorporated. Yes, there is an Inc. period behind Batchewana First Nation. So I'll discuss Batchewana First Nation Incorporated. They don't need to give anything that incorporated makes. So that's our Bow Lake wind farms, our gold mines, our solar farms, any business or anything that Batchewana First Nation Incorporated owns and has financial funding for is kept away from the Financial Transparency Act, which it should send up all kinds of red flags to the community members. Oh, why is it okay? You got to be 100% responsible for what the government gives us, but you don't got to be responsible to the people for what you're making for the people and be responsible to give them whether we're broke, rich, or have no money at all. So it's a big smoke screen that they play every couple years saying, oh yes, we're financially responsible, we're taking care and we're spending the money properly. Wrong. Batchewana First Nation Incorporated is either profiting lots of money, or we're broke, or we're in debt. Nobody knows these questions. Very simple questions. Our elected leadership, ran on the basic principles of transparency alone. There is none. There's no transparency here. It's the old divide the people, every 2 years, we're fighting. But we got to understand why we're in this predicament. The Indian Act. The Indian Act was put into place. Correction. I'll explain the Indian Act in, I guess, my words. But the Indian Act is a Canadian federal law that was first passed in 1876 and has since undergone numerous amendments. The Act originally consolidated several existing laws and policies that govern the relationship between the Canadian government and Indigenous peoples of Canada. The Indian Act has been criticized for its negative impact on Indigenous peoples, including restrictions on their freedom of movement, the forcible removal of Indigenous children from their families and communities to attend residential schools, and the imposition of colonial structures of government and land ownership. While the Indian Act has undergone some amendments in recent years aimed at addressing some of these issues, it remains a controversial piece of legislation and a source of ongoing debate and discussion in Canada. Many Indigenous people and organizations continue to call for its repeal and replacement with a new framework for Indigenous and self-government and reconciliation. So, that's essentially what the Indian Act is. A lot of decisions are made without the people's, input at all. Our people will say, oh, well, you should go attend these council meetings. You should go over there. Well, the problem is when you do go over there and attend these meetings, you'll sit for the introductions and, a little basic humming and hawing. And then you know what? They're going to ask you to leave and go sit in the hallway because we're going to talk about in camera. Where's the transparency when you're hiding behind doors and your members can't even listen to important decisions being made on their community? You got to remember, you're accountable to your people, your constituents, if that's what you want to call us. You should be accountable to us, not ignore us, not stick your nose up at us, not walk around the community like you're better than us, thinking you know what is right for us when you have no idea what your people even want. Stop making decisions based on what you think is best for the people. Start gaining some input of your people. You're civil servants. You're for the people, not yourselves. So we understand that the Indian Act is a problem. So I'm going to understand on why I think it's a very oppressive piece of legislation. So the Indian Act is considered a form of oppression because it has historically been used to deny Indigenous peoples in Canada their basic human rights, autonomy, and self-determination. The Act has given the Canadian government broad powers over Indigenous peoples and their lands and has served to reinforce colonial structures of governance and control. Excuse me, I'm going to have a drink of coffee here. Some of the specific ways in which the Indian Act has been used to oppress Indigenous people include residential schools. The Indian Act allowed the government to establish residential schools which were designed to assimilate Indigenous children into the Euro-Canadian culture by separating them from their families and communities. These schools were notorious for their abuse and neglect of Indigenous children, leading to their trauma and intergenerational harm. Number 2, land control. The Act gave the government the control over Indigenous lands and resources, leading to the forced relocation of Indigenous people from their traditional territories and the loss of their cultural and spirit connections to the land. Number 3, which is very important, bureaucratic control. The Act establishes a system of bureaucratic control over Indigenous people, including the imposition of elected chiefs and councils and the denial of Indigenous governance structures. 4, cultural suppression. The Act prohibited Indigenous cultural practices and ceremonies, including the potluck and Sundance, and criminalized Indigenous spiritual practices. Overall, the Indian Act has served as a tool of colonization and oppression that has undermined the sovereignty and dignity of the Indigenous people in Canada. Its legacy continues to impact the Indigenous communities today, and efforts towards reconciliation and healing require a critical examination of the Act's history and ongoing effects. So, we know why we're in this position. The Indian Act. When John A. Macdonald removed the Indian agents from our communities, it was replaced with the Indian Act. So essentially, our so-called leaders in our communities are glorified Indian agents. You know why? Because they enforce the Indian Act. They follow their bureaucratic duties to that Indian Act, which has led us astray for all this corruption in our community. Number 1, Jonias, is money. Money. There's always been problems. People taking money in our community, people embezzling money, people stealing from us, right in our own community members. Why hasn't any of these people been criminally prosecuted? Why? This is my opinion again. Because they're all in on the gig. We get it. The system was put into place to make us fight and to make money a huge issue. We have Batchewana First Nation. The Transparency Act takes care of that. We have Batchewana First Nation Incorporated, where all the good money is, but nobody seems to know, or no one's allowed to talk about that. The solution to this is Batchewana First Nation needs a forensic audit for Batchewana First Nation Incorporated. I'm not worried about the Financial Transparency Act because it covers Batchewana First Nation on what the government gives us. We need a forensic audit to clear the books. We need to start fresh in our community. The number one reason is for our future generations. If we don't fix this financial nonsense that's been going on for the last 50 to 100 years, it's going to continue to corrupt us, and we're going to find ourselves with nothing at the end of the day. And our so-called leadership, Indian agents, need to really figure out what to do. Because you know what? As chief of Batchewana First Nation, when you travel somewhere, you can't take government funding from Batchewana First Nation to get you there. You can't take funding from AIAI to get you there. You can't take funding from the North Shore Tribal Council to get you there. You can't take funding from the Union of Ontario Indians. You can't take funding from the Shingwak School. All these different funding streams our elected people get to dip into, to travel around, 3, 4, 5 times they're dipping into every time when they should only be dipping into one. Imagine we had financial transparency, fiscal responsibility. There would be none of this fighting every year because, the solution would be forensic audit is going to tell us what Batchewana First Nation Incorporated has. Example again to the cookies. Batchewana First Nation Incorporated has all this wonderful cookies in here. It's very nice. But we're not allowed to know what's in there. We can't. So in order to find out what's in there, we need a forensic audit. Boom. The forensic audit will say what they did with all these cookies, right down to the very penny. And when we do that, that's when I believe our community will start benefiting. We got to also go into how our money is being spent in our community. Batchewana First Nation example. Every funding stream that comes into our community, say healthcare, education, housing, roads and grounds. At the beginning of every year when the government gives us that money, our elected leaders say, we're going to take 10% out of every budget and put it in a kitty for us. So over the years, imagine 10% of every government-funded money is coming in the community, going into a little war chest, a little fund where they get to dip into and, spend all kinds of money fighting their own people in courts, etc. The list goes on. Imagine they took that money and they put it into, some new parks for our kids. A nice gym or an establishment for our children in our community to go to work out instead of going into town and using the gym. We should have that facility here. So again, a brief discussion on financial transparency, on what my views are on it. And we also got to, let's look at, our federal governments, for example. Every time there's a chance that the conservative government is going to come into power, all the First Nations throw up their hands and saying, they're going to defund us, they're taking money away, they're going to cut back on everything, But essentially, a conservative government is a fiscally responsible government. So they're going to come look at all the books of all the First Nations, and they're going to go through with a fine-tooth comb, because this is our money, taxpayers' money that we pay, that the government spends. They want to know where every penny is going. So they look at First Nations, and under the glory years of a liberal government where there's no financial transparency, there's no financial accountability, they get to free spend and do whatever they want with all that government money coming in. But when the conservatives come in, they're saying, you're mismanaging this money, you're mismanaging that money. We're going to take it back until the next fiscal budget, and you can show us you need that money and you're spending it properly. So it's not that they're a racist government. It's not that they're, not good for Indian people. It's the other way around. They're actually holding our Indian agents, our elected officials, accountable for what they're spending, and they're mismanaging their money, so they take it back. They take it back. They're not cutting it back. They've just been mismanaging it. It's really frustrating because I worry about our future. The political punchline they talk about, our future generations. Every child matters. Well, what have you done for the future children? Instead of lining your pockets and ignoring your people at every chance you can get, getting mad when they call you out on stuff. We're a small community, and we look at small communities, the municipalities across these lands. Why is there long-term mayors in these little cities that are very successful? Because they manage that money properly, and there isn't a problem with the financials. They're spending it properly, it's being taken care of, and the people respect what is going on. So as the people of Batchewana First Nation, we got to start demanding the exact same thing for our children's future. It's very important. So I hope this video opened to some light on, the financials and monies in our community. But the solution is, or the problem is, the Indian Act causes all this commotion and all this infighting about monies. The Indian Act does a very good job at that. That's the problem. We need to start in 2024 or right now with a forensic audit. Show every member where every penny is going. We need to know that in order to start fresh and step forward to something new and better for all of us. Imagine all the governments that are double dipping and taking money from all kinds of stuff, profiting because they sit there. Imagine they had fiscal responsibility. That's going to trickle down to the everyday Indian in our First Nations. We would get our houses fixed when they need to be. They're quick to say, you're not following your agreement, you're not paying rent, so we're going to send you an eviction notice and put that stress on you because you, the tenant, ain't following your agreement. Well, who's holding you responsible to your end of the agreement? All our houses are in disarray. We have stuff falling off them. We ask for repairs. They never show up. So, it's time for change here. A whole new breath of fiscal responsibility where we can all benefit, where we can all sit at the same table and eat together. So I'll close this video and say Chimigwech for watching. Again, this is just a veteran's perspective, my opinion on some financial issues in my community of Batchewana First Nation, and I believe in change. And I believe if we take care of their money, our future generations will thank us. Because look across Canada where the governments, the communities that cleaned up their books, how well they're benefiting now today. It's a change, night and day difference, and I believe in change. And we, the people, can vote for that change. So again, Chimigwech, until next time, stay vigilant. Bamapi go amen.